The wound in your leg had turned black. Not the healthy black of a scab healing, the rot black of flesh dying. You could smell it. Everyone in the tent could smell it. Sweet and putrid, the smell of your own body decomposing while you were still alive. You were 17 years old, lying on blood-soaked straw in a field hospital that was really just a collection of torn canvas tents. A surgeon had looked at your leg 3 days ago, shrugged, and moved on to someone he thought he could save. Now you waited. For the rot to spread, for the fever to take you, for death to finally end the agony that had started when a musket ball shattered your shin during the battle. That battle felt like years ago but had only been 5 days. 5 days since you'd marched into enemy fire following orders you didn't understand for a cause you never believed in. 5 days since you'd watched the boy next to you take a cannonball to the chest and simply disappear in a spray of red. 5 days since you'd learned that war in the 1600s wasn't about honor or glory or serving your country. It was about dying slowly in a tent that smelled like death while officers who'd never been near the fighting decided whether you were worth the cost of treatment. You were. The gangrene made that decision for them. The 1600s saw Europe locked in almost constant warfare. The 30 Years' War, the English Civil War, endless conflicts between nations, religions, and rival claimants to thrones. Armies needed soldiers, thousands upon thousands of them, and they got them however they could. Some men enlisted voluntarily, lured by promises of steady pay and plunder. Most were pressed, forced conscription. Agents would sweep through towns and villages, rounding up men by force. If you were the right age and couldn't prove you were essential elsewhere, you were taken, dragged from your home, your family, your life, and handed a weapon you'd never used. Training was minimal or non-existent. March in formation. Load your musket, fire when ordered. That was it. Most soldiers had no idea how to actually fight. They were just bodies filling ranks, and their officers knew it. The armies of the 1600s weren't professional forces. They were mobs of conscripts commanded by nobles who'd bought their commission and had no military training themselves. The blind leading the blind into battles where death came from every direction and survival was mostly luck. James Morton was 16 when he was pressed into service for the English army in 1643. He'd been working on his family's farm when soldiers arrived. They took James and 2 other boys from the village. His father protested. One of the soldiers hit him with a musket, but hard enough to knock him down. James's mother screamed. The soldiers ignored her. James was marched to a camp outside town where hundreds of other pressed men waited. Most were terrified. Some were crying. All knew they had no choice. Desertion meant execution if you were caught. And your family would face consequences too, so you stayed. You learned to march, learned to hold a pike or fire a musket, and within weeks you were on a battlefield facing trained soldiers who wanted to kill you. James's first battle was pure chaos. The officers formed them into ranks and ordered them to march forward toward enemy lines. The enemy had cannons. James watched the first volley tear through the front ranks, turning men into meat. The formation wavered. Officers screamed at them to hold, to keep marching. James's legs moved on their own, following the man in front of him. Then musket fire. All around him men dropped, shot through the chest, the head, the gut. James kept walking because stopping meant being trampled by the men behind you. He reached musket range and fired without aiming. The smoke was so thick he couldn't see what he was shooting at. Then came the order to charge. James ran forward with hundreds of others straight into enemy pikes. Men were impaled, screaming, dying. James swung his musket like a club, hitting whoever was in front of him. He didn't know if he killed anyone. He was just trying not to die. The battle ended when the enemy retreated. James stood in a field covered in bodies. Some were moving, crying for help. Most were still. James looked down and realized he was covered in blood. He didn't know whose. He wasn't wounded. He survived, but he didn't feel victorious. He felt sick. That night the soldiers camped in the same field where they'd fought. Bodies were still everywhere. No one had time to bury them. James lay on the ground next to corpses and tried to sleep. He couldn't. The sounds of wounded men dying filled the darkness. Moaning, crying, begging for water or for God or for their mothers. No one helped them. There weren't enough surgeons, not enough supplies. The wounded who couldn't walk were left where they'd fallen. Some would die from their wounds. Others would die from exposure or thirst. A few might survive until morning and be collected. Most wouldn't. James lay there listening to men die and understood that this was war. Not the glory he'd heard about in stories, just suffering and death and the knowledge that his turn was coming. Life as a soldier was brutal even when you weren't fighting. The pay promised by recruiters rarely materialized. Officers embezzled it, supply chains broke down, soldiers went months without wages, food was scarce. You were supposed to receive rations, but corruption meant you got far less than promised: spoiled meat, moldy bread, sometimes nothing. Soldiers foraged, which was a polite word for stealing from civilians. You'd raid farms, take whatever you could find. The locals hated you. They'd hide their food, their animals, sometimes their daughters. Because soldiers in the 1600s were more like roving bandits than disciplined troops, rape was common. Murder wasn't unusual. Entire villages could be destroyed if a unit decided there was plunder to be had, and officers rarely stopped it. Sometimes they encouraged it. Let the men blow off steam. Let them take payment in goods since actual pay wasn't coming. James participated in the looting because the alternative was starvation. He watched things happen that made him sick. Watched soldiers do things to civilians that he couldn't stop even if he'd wanted to. And he hated himself for it. Hated what the war was turning him into. But survival meant going along, meant becoming as brutal as everyone else. If you were James, 16 years old and forced into an army you didn't choose, watching atrocities you couldn't stop, becoming someone you didn't recognize, how would you have lived with yourself? What would you have told yourself to justify the things you did and saw? Disease killed more soldiers than combat, far more. Camps were filthy. Thousands of men living in close quarters with no sanitation. Human waste everywhere. Water sources contaminated. Food rotting. Disease spread like wildfire. Typhus, dysentery, plague, smallpox. Once someone got sick, everyone got sick. There was no treatment. Surgeons had almost no medical knowledge. They'd bleed you or purge you, treatments that usually made things worse. Most sick soldiers just died. James watched half his unit die from camp fever over the course of 3 weeks. Men would be fine one day, burning with fever the next, dead within a week. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Eventually, they just burned them. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the already overwhelming stench of the camp. James got sick too. High fever, chills, severe diarrhea. He thought he was going to die. He lay in his tent, too weak to move, his body emptying itself from both ends. No one helped. If you couldn't fight, you were useless. James survived through sheer luck. His fever broke after 5 days. He recovered slowly, left weaker and thinner than before, but he was alive, for now. But here's what made the soldier's life in the 1600s even more hellish. You couldn't leave. Desertion was punishable by death. If you ran and were caught, you'd be executed in front of the entire unit as an example, usually by hanging, sometimes by firing squad. James watched 3 men executed for desertion. They tried to sneak away at night. They'd been caught within 2 days and brought back. The officers made everyone watch as they were hanged. The men kicked and choked for minutes before dying. Their bodies were left hanging for days as a warning. This was what happened if you tried to escape, so soldiers stayed. They endured conditions that were barely survivable. They fought in battles where death was random and meaningless. They committed atrocities because that's what armies did. And they knew that even if they survived the war, they'd return home traumatized, often disabled, with nothing. No pension, no support, no recognition. Just the memories of what they'd seen and done. Think about how we treat soldiers today. Veterans' benefits, medical care, recognition for service. Now imagine none of that. Imagine being forced into an army, surviving hell, and returning home to nothing but judgment from people who'd never been there. That was the reality for soldiers in the 1600s. Would you have had the strength to survive it? Would you have wanted to? Most soldiers didn't survive. They died in battle from disease, from infected wounds, from starvation. The ones who lived were often permanently damaged. James made it 2 years. He fought in half a dozen battles, watched hundreds of men die, participated in the looting and destruction of civilian towns, became someone he barely recognized. Then came the battle where his luck ran out. It wasn't even a major engagement, just a skirmish with enemy cavalry. James's unit was caught in open ground. The cavalry charged, horses and riders smashing into infantry lines. James tried to use his pike to defend himself, but a rider got through and slashed at him with a sword. The blade caught his shoulder and arm, cutting deep. James fell. The battle moved past him. When it was over, he was still alive but badly wounded. His arm was nearly severed. A surgeon looked at it and decided amputation was necessary. They did it right there in the field with no anesthesia. 4 men held James down while the surgeon sawed through bone. James screamed until he passed out from the pain. He survived the amputation but developed an infection. The stump where his arm had been turned red and swollen. Pus leaked from the wound. Fever came next. James knew what this meant. He'd seen it before. Once infection set in after amputation, you usually died. He was moved to a field hospital tent where other dying men waited. No treatment was given, just a place to lie down while your body failed. James spent 5 days in that tent. The fever climbed higher. He drifted in and out of consciousness. In his lucid moments, he thought about his family, his mother, his father, the farm he'd been taken from. He wondered if they knew he was dying, if they'd ever find out what happened to him. Probably not. Soldiers died anonymously. Their families were just told they'd fallen in service. No details, no body to bury, just gone. James died on a cold morning in 1645. He was 18 years old. His body was buried in a mass grave with dozens of others. No marker. No record beyond a note in a regimental log. Soldier, wounded, deceased. That was all. His family never learned the details of his death. They were just told he died serving the crown. His mother cried, his father said nothing. And within a year, James was largely forgotten. Just another casualty in a war that would drag on for years more. The war continued. More men were pressed. More battles were fought. More soldiers died in fields and tents and ditches. And the people making decisions about the war, the nobles and officers and politicians, they never faced the consequences. They never marched into enemy fire, never slept in mud surrounded by corpses, never watched their limbs sawn off without anesthesia. They made decisions from comfortable rooms and comfortable lives, and young men like James died to execute those decisions. The glory they spoke of, the honor and duty and righteous cause, none of that existed on the battlefield. There was only mud and blood and screaming. Only the knowledge that you were expendable, that your life meant nothing to the people commanding you, that you'd die for reasons you didn't understand in a war that would be forgotten within generations. James's sacrifice meant nothing. His suffering accomplished nothing. He was one of tens of thousands who died in conflicts historians barely remember, wars that resolved nothing and were replaced by new wars within years. Even after the wars ended, after peace treaties were signed and armies disbanded, the soldiers got nothing. Those who survived limped home with missing limbs and shattered minds. No compensation, no medical care, no recognition. They were expected to simply return to their previous lives as if nothing had happened. Most couldn't. They were too damaged physically and psychologically. They became beggars, vagrants, burdens on communities that didn't want them. The same communities that had cheered when they'd marched off to war now wanted nothing to do with them. And the system that had pressed them into service, that had used their bodies as expendable resources, that system moved on to the next conflict and the next generation of young men to consume. The 1600s proved what every war proves, that soldiers die for causes that don't matter. That glory is a lie told to convince young men to accept their own destruction. That war serves the interests of the powerful while grinding up the powerless. James died believing he was serving something greater than himself, but there was nothing greater, just men with power sending men without power to die for reasons that benefited neither. That's the truth of war. Then, now, always. And we keep forgetting it, keep romanticizing it, keep telling the same lies that convinced James to accept his fate. Until the next war, and the next James, and the next pointless death in a long line of pointless deaths that history records as necessary and noble when they were neither.